The fog in Appalachia doesn't just cling to the trees, it swallows them whole. The deeper you drive into those mountains, the more the world seems to fade, until even the sound of your own heartbeat feels foreign. Locals still whisper about the valley that isn't on any map, a place where bloodlines ran too deep and the earth itself began to rot beneath them. No one says its name anymore. Some claim the government erased it, others say it was the mountain's way of sealing its own wound. When the first researcher arrived, she thought the stories were nothing more than rustic folklore warnings told by old miners who'd lost their minds to isolation. But as she followed the brittle trail of medical reports, censored files, and unexplained deformities, a pattern emerged. The same surnames repeated through every generation. The same faces reappeared in faded photographs a century apart. And the same illness, one that modern science couldn't name, kept resurfacing wherever the family had lived. By the time she reached the end of the dirt road, night had fallen like a curtain. There were no lights, no signs of life, only a smell in the air, metallic and sweet, like the scent of rusted blood. She found the cabin at the edge of the valley, its windows shuttered, its door half open as if waiting for her. The silence was unnatural. Even the wind held its breath. Somewhere deep in the woods, something moved slowly, deliberately, and she realized the stories hadn't been exaggerations at all. They were warnings. And she was too far in to turn back. The discovery of the hidden valley began with nothing more than a curiosity, an anomaly buried deep in the archives of a state university. Dr. Eliza Warren, a genetic researcher with a fascination for hereditary diseases, had been tracing the origins of an incurable condition spreading quietly among rural communities in Appalachia. The genetic sequences didn't match any known mutation in medical literature, yet the DNA samples she studied all carried a faint trace of the same ancestral signature. That mystery pulled her deeper into the past, where she uncovered faint references to a valley that appeared briefly in 19th-century medical records before vanishing completely from history. Its name was scrawled only once, in a doctor's handwritten note dated 1894, alongside a warning, "Do not go there. The blood is wrong." Intrigued and unsettled, Eliza began to search for this missing place. She contacted local historians, sifted through abandoned property deeds, and compared old maps that didn't quite align. In some records, the valley was marked near the border of two forgotten mining towns. In others, it was simply erased, replaced by dense forestland. Every lead ended in silence. Locals grew uneasy when she mentioned it, their expressions tightening with unspoken fear. One old librarian, when pressed for information, whispered that there were families who never left the hills because they were never meant to. That phrase haunted her as she traced back census files from the 1800s and realized an entire cluster of surnames had disappeared after 1900, as if the people themselves had been deliberately erased. The deeper she went, the more deliberate the disappearance seemed. Old photographs had been removed from public archives, entire family trees struck through in faded ink. Geological surveys hinted at landslides that supposedly buried whole settlements, yet no official record of the disaster existed. The pattern suggested something else, something intentional. The government had sealed off parts of the region after the Second World War, labeling them as restricted environmental zones, though no contamination was ever reported there. Her research funding was quietly withdrawn when she tried to apply for field access. That only fueled her determination. One evening, while cross-referencing weather patterns from 1932, she found a scanned aerial photograph mislabeled under a different county. At first glance, it showed only forest and mist, but under magnification, faint geometric shapes appeared, outlines of rooftops and a winding dirt path cutting through the trees. The valley wasn't gone. It was hidden, shielded by generations of silence and thick Appalachian wilderness. For Eliza, it was no longer a research pursuit but an obsession. The answer to her genetic mystery lay somewhere within that forgotten patch of earth, waiting beneath decades of dust, rumor, and buried guilt. The discovery of the missing census began when Dr. Eliza Warren turned her attention from genetic data to the historical record. She had gathered fragments of names and birthplaces from medical documents that hinted at a specific region in Appalachia, but without official data, it was like chasing ghosts through fog. Her research led her to the 1930 United States Census, one of the few official sources that could confirm family lines and settlements in isolated regions. What she found was both puzzling and terrifying. The census listed dozens of families living in a remote mountain valley, their occupations marked as farmers or laborious, their children numerous and closely related by blood. Yet when she advanced to the 1940 census, those names had vanished completely. No deaths recorded, no migrations, no trace of relocation. It was as if an entire community had been erased overnight. She cross-checked the information with state archives, church records, and burial registries, expecting to find evidence of a natural disaster or epidemic. None existed. There were no death certificates for the missing residents, no obituaries, no newspaper reports. The valley itself stopped appearing on state maps after 1935. Even more unnerving was the discovery that government property surveys had redrawn district boundaries around the area during that same decade, effectively removing it from official documentation. The absence felt deliberate, a quiet rewriting of geography. Every bureaucratic path that should have led her to answers ended in blacked-out documents and red stamps reading classified. Eliza began to suspect the families in the valley had not simply disappeared, they had been erased. When she reached out to elderly locals living on the mountain's edge, they refused to speak openly. One woman told her, in a trembling voice, that the people up there stopped counting themselves long before the government stopped counting them. That cryptic remark deepened her unease. She realized this wasn't a mere archival error but the remnants of an intentional cover-up. Someone, decades ago, had wanted the world to forget that valley existed. Late one night, while combing through microfilm reels in an old county office, Eliza found a single torn census page tucked between unrelated files. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It bore the same surnames she had traced in her genetic studies: Warren, Lively, Boone, and beside each name was a note written in red pencil: omit from record. The page wasn't supposed to exist. Her pulse quickened as she realized the implications. The people she'd been researching had been methodically wiped from history, their existence reduced to a secret annotation in forgotten ink. The truth was no longer just scientific, it was historical erasure on purpose, and someone had made sure it stayed that way. The journey into the woods began with a silence that felt almost sentient. Dr. Eliza Warren had spent months behind a screen, deciphering genetic codes and reading censored archives, but now she stood before the living heart of what those records had tried to hide. The Appalachian forest stretched before her like a dark ocean, dense, ancient, and uninviting. A rusted metal gate blocked the old logging road, its no trespassing sign long faded and pitted with bullet holes. Beyond it, the dirt trail disappeared into a tangle of trees so thick that daylight barely reached the ground. She hesitated, aware that she was stepping into a place that had rejected outsiders for nearly a century. Yet curiosity had become something stronger, almost a pull, as if the valley itself was calling her home. With a small backpack, a lantern, and a weathered map she had reconstructed from overlapping 1930s survey sketches, Eliza began her descent. The air grew colder and heavier the deeper she went. The forest seemed untouched by time, no phone signal, no sounds of civilization, only the rhythmic crunch of her boots against the wet earth and the occasional cry of a distant crow. The trail wound downward, twisting between moss-covered rocks and skeletal trees whose branches reached like arms toward the sky. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard running water, but it came and went like an echo that didn't belong. As dusk settled, the fog began to rise, curling through the trees like breath from an unseen presence. The deeper she ventured, the more the world behind her seemed to dissolve. Her compass spun erratically, and her map no longer matched the terrain. Landmarks she had marked earlier were gone or rearranged, as if the forest itself was shifting to confuse her. The silence pressed harder now, thick and oppressive. Even the crickets had stopped singing. Hours later, when her legs ached and her lantern's light began to dim, she noticed something unnatural ahead. The trees gave way to a small clearing, and there, half swallowed by vines and thyme, stood the remnants of a dirt path, too deliberate to be nature's work, too precise to be chance. She followed it until it split into two directions, one that seemed to lead downhill into the valley, and another toward a cluster of dark shapes obscured by fog. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rain mixed with rust. Her heart raced as she realized she was no longer merely trespassing into forbidden land, she was crossing the threshold into something the world had deliberately buried. Every instinct told her to turn back, but something older than fear kept her moving forward, into the woods that seemed to breathe with her every step. The cabin appeared out of nowhere, as if the mist itself had shaped it from memory. Dr. Eliza Warren had been walking for hours through the twisting Appalachian forest, her flashlight flickering against trees so old their bark looked petrified. Then, just beyond a bend where the fog thickened into a white wall, she saw it, a weather-beaten wooden structure sagging beneath the weight of time. It was smaller than she expected, no more than 2 rooms at most, its roof caved in at one corner and the windows shuttered from the inside. What stopped her wasn't its decay but the faint warmth radiating from the air around it. The night was cold enough to sting her fingers, yet near the cabin, the temperature shifted slightly, as if someone had recently been there. She approached cautiously, her footsteps muffled by wet leaves. The door was half open, creaking softly against the frame as if moved by a slow breath of wind. Inside, the air smelled of mold, smoke, and something faintly metallic. Her flashlight beam swept across a rough wooden table covered in dust, a broken lantern, and an old iron kettle resting on the hearth. Everything looked frozen in time, yet there was evidence of recent life, ashes still grey in the fireplace, a single chair pulled back as though someone had just stood up. Her pulse quickened. No one had lived here for decades according to every record she'd seen. The walls were lined with photographs, sepia-toned portraits nailed haphazardly onto warped planks. The faces in the pictures shared uncanny resemblances, the same wide-set eyes, the same hollow expressions, the same almost imperceptible deformities that blurred the line between human and something not quite right. Eliza leaned closer, her flashlight trembling slightly as she noticed that the names scrawled beneath each photograph matched those erased from the census. The realization tightened her chest. This was the house of the missing bloodline, the place history had tried to forget. A sudden creak from the back room broke the silence. She froze, every sense alert. The sound was too deliberate, too heavy to be the settling of old wood. Slowly, she turned toward the narrow hallway leading deeper into the cabin. Her beam caught the edge of a doorway, half concealed by hanging cloth. Beyond it, the darkness was thick and absolute. Something shifted there, a faint movement, like someone stepping just out of sight. She held her breath, waiting for another sound, but none came. Only the rhythmic drip of water somewhere beneath the floorboards echoed through the room. It was then she realized that the house wasn't abandoned. It was waiting, preserved by the silence of those who'd never left. The first night in the valley was unlike any darkness Dr. Eliza Warren had ever known. After discovering the cabin, she decided to stay until morning, reasoning that fatigue and disorientation were clouding her judgment. She set up a small recorder on the table to document what she'd found, but as soon as the sun dipped behind the ridge line, an unsettling quiet filled the air. The forest, once alive with the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves, went completely still. Even the wind seemed to vanish. Eliza sat near the cold hearth, listening, waiting for the natural night sounds to return. Instead, what came was something else, a faint whisper, distant at first, then closer, threading through the walls like smoke. It began as a murmur, almost like words spoken underwater. She froze, thinking perhaps it was an echo of her own breathing. But the whispers had rhythm, a strange cadence that rose and fell as if several voices were speaking in unison. She turned off her flashlight and held her breath. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and aware. Her heart hammered in her chest. Then came the low moan, a sound that didn't belong to wind or animal, drawn out and trembling, as though it came from beneath the cabin itself. Dust drifted from the ceiling with each vibration. Eliza knelt and placed her hand on the wooden floor. The boards felt cold, but something faint pulsed below them, like movement deep within the ground. She considered leaving, grabbing her pack, and forcing her way back through the forest, but the scientist in her demanded proof. She placed the recorder near the floor and pressed the red button. The whispers returned, now clearer, though still impossible to decipher. They sounded almost human but warped, like the voices of people trying to speak through water or bone. The air grew colder. Suddenly, a single knock came from beneath the boards, slow, deliberate, and strong enough to shake the dust loose from the rafters. Eliza stumbled back, her flashlight flickering as she pointed it toward the floor. The knocking stopped. The silence returned, but now it felt different, expectant. When she replayed the recording seconds later, the sound wasn't what she remembered. Instead of knocks, the tape carried faint voices saying her name, stretched and distorted beyond recognition. She stared at the recorder, every instinct screaming that something unnatural was alive beneath that cabin. But even as fear took hold, curiosity burned stronger. Somewhere below her feet was the key to everything: the blood, the sickness, the vanished people, and the mountain seemed to know she had come to find it. Morning came as a pale gray light seeping through the cracks in the cabin walls, revealing what the darkness had hidden. Dr. Eliza Warren hadn't slept. The recorder sat silent on the table, its battery dead, and her notebook was filled with half-legible lines written in shaking hands. She was sure of what she'd heard in the night, but daylight made it easier to dismiss it as exhaustion or imagination. Still, something compelled her to search deeper. The cabin was smaller than it had appeared the night before, but an uneven seam in the ceiling caught her attention. A narrow pull rope hung from a warped beam. When she tugged it, the ceiling groaned, and a ladder creaked down from the attic. A cold draft spilled from above, carrying the scent of old wood and something faintly sour, like forgotten decay. Eliza climbed carefully, her flashlight beam slicing through dust that hung like fog. The attic was cramped and low, its air thick and stale. Boxes and furniture were piled in corners beneath cobwebs, untouched for decades. But along the far wall, something glimmered faintly beneath the dust: a cluster of framed photographs, arranged with uncanny precision. She moved closer and brushed one clean with her sleeve. The image was black and white, the corners curled, the glass cracked. It showed a family of 6 standing in front of this very cabin. They wore outdated clothes and blank expressions, but what caught her attention was the resemblance. Each face mirrored the others too closely, eyes too far apart, identical jawlines, mouths tilted in the same faint, unnatural smile. She looked at the next photograph and the next, realizing with growing unease that the faces were repeating. The children in one photo had become the parents in another, their offspring nearly indistinguishable from them. Decades seemed to pass in the images, yet the features never changed. In one picture dated 1918, she recognized a man whose face appeared again in a photograph from 1946, unchanged except for deeper lines around his eyes. Her stomach turned. These weren't just family portraits, they were generations folding in on themselves. The family had bred within their own bloodline, over and over, until individuality blurred into replication. At the center of the wall hung one larger photograph, its frame carved with initials that matched the surnames erased from the census. The figures were older now, their deformities more pronounced: crooked spines, misshapen hands, eyes that seemed to drift in different directions. Eliza felt her throat tighten as she realized that the faces weren't entirely unfamiliar. In the shape of their eyes and the curve of their mouths, she saw echoes of her own genetic subjects, the same anomalies, the same signature mutation. The sickness she'd been tracing hadn't originated from nature. It had been born here, preserved through devotion, secrecy, and generations of corrupted blood. Eliza left the cabin that afternoon, her mind spinning with questions and her heart pounding with a mixture of awe and dread. The photographs in the attic had rewritten everything she thought she knew about inherited disease. She followed a faint trail downhill from the cabin, where the ground grew soft and the air smelled faintly metallic. A narrow stream ran through the valley, its surface glinting under the weak daylight. It was shallow and slow-moving, but something about it looked unnatural. The water had a faint reddish tint, almost imperceptible, and patches of soil along the banks were stained the same color. She crouched beside it, dipping her fingers in, and felt a strange slickness like oil, but lighter. Out of habit, she filled a small vial from her field kit, labeling it with trembling hands. Back at the cabin, she set up her portable analyzer, a compact device she often used for preliminary testing. As the machine hummed softly, she watched the data appear on the small screen. The water contained unusually high levels of hemoglobin and protein traces associated with organic tissue. It was impossible. She ran the test again, certain of contamination, but the results were identical. Mixed within the natural minerals were genetic fragments, microscopic traces of human DNA, broken but recognizable. More disturbing was the pattern it displayed. It matched the same genetic signature she had found in the archived medical samples, the corrupted lineage that had plagued her research. Somehow, the bloodline had seeped into the land itself. She sat in stunned silence, staring at the stream through the cracked window. It wasn't simply environmental decay or runoff from an old burial site. The valley was leaching the remnants of generations who had lived and died within it. Whatever they had done to preserve their bloodline had bound their DNA to the earth. But there was something else in the data, something that made no sense. Embedded within the fragmented sequences was an unfamiliar marker, a genetic code that didn't correspond to any recorded human genome. It was subtle but deliberate, as though something foreign had integrated with their DNA over time. Eliza sent the data through her software, hoping for a reference point, but the algorithm returned only a single word, *unknown star. She stared at the screen, her pulse quickening as realization dawned that this wasn't just an inherited disease. It was evolution gone wrong, an unnatural mutation forged in isolation and secrecy. The valley wasn't merely haunted by its people, it was alive with them, every root and stone carrying traces of a bloodline that refused to die. The sickness hadn't disappeared with the missing families. It was still here, waiting in the water, breathing beneath the surface, rewriting whatever touched it. As the days passed, Eliza's unease deepened. She ventured beyond the cabin, exploring the remnants of the valley that history had erased. What she found were foundations of collapsed homes, rusted tools buried in soil, and gravestones so eroded that the names had nearly vanished. Yet, despite the decay, it felt as though the valley was still inhabited. She noticed subtle signs, a freshly broken twig, the faint flicker of movement in the tree line, the lingering warmth of a fire that should have long gone cold. One afternoon, she stumbled upon an abandoned church half swallowed by ivy. The steeple had collapsed, but the interior remained strangely preserved. Wooden pews stood in neat rows, and a crude altar was draped in tattered cloth. Behind it, carved into the wall, was a phrase written in old Appalachian script, *pure blood keeps the land alive. Those words echoed through her thoughts as she began piecing together the valley's true history. From the fragments of letters and diary pages she recovered, a grim story took shape. The people who once lived there had isolated themselves not out of fear, but by choice. Generations earlier, they had come to believe that outsiders carried corruption, both moral and physical, that threatened to weaken their bloodline. Their elders, often revered as prophets, preached that the only way to preserve their purity was to marry within their own. Over time, that belief hardened into law. What began as faith became fanaticism, and what started as survival turned into self-destruction. Eliza found references to something called the Pact, an agreement made by the founding families to reject all contact with the outside world. Each generation swore to maintain their lineage, even when it meant ignoring the growing deformities and sickness among their children. The writings spoke of this illness not as a curse but as proof of devotion, a mark of divine favor for keeping the blood untainted. The more she read, the more it became clear that the people of the valley had transformed their suffering into doctrine. They had convinced themselves that the mutations were not disease but destiny. When she shared her findings with a local shopkeeper from a nearby town, his expression turned pale. He told her in a low voice that his grandmother had once warned him never to go near the old valley, claiming their ancestors made a deal with the mountain to keep outsiders away. They thought the sickness would protect them, he said quietly. But it protected the mountain instead. The weight of his words settled over her as the truth crystallized. The valley wasn't cursed by misfortune, it was punished by its own belief. The silence of the locals wasn't ignorance, it was guilt passed down through generations, a vow never to speak of what their blood had done. Eliza had spent days in the valley, uncovering fragments of a nightmare that science alone couldn't explain. The deeper she ventured, the more she felt watched, not with hostility, but with the weary patience of something that had been waiting too long. One misty morning, she followed the stream that bled red through the forest until it curved behind a hill and disappeared into a cave-like opening beneath a cliff. The entrance was half hidden by overgrown roots and ferns, as though the mountain itself was trying to keep it secret. Inside, The air was cold and thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic. Her flashlight beam trembled as she descended a few steps, and there she saw it, a dim flicker of movement deeper within. She called out, her voice echoing softly, but no answer came. Then a shadow shifted, and from the darkness emerged a figure. He was thin, almost skeletal, draped in layers of worn fabric that might once have been clothing. His hair was grey and uneven, his skin pale as wax, and his eyes caught the light in a way that made them seem too large for his face. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Eliza's mind raced to rationalize what she was seeing. This man should not exist. Every record indicated the bloodline had died out decades ago, but standing before her was proof that at least one had survived. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, as though unused for years. "You came," he said, his words slow, deliberate, and strangely assured. "The sickness remembers its own." The phrase sent a chill through her. She stepped closer, and he didn't retreat. In his gaze was no malice, only an ancient sadness. He spoke in fragments, memories passed down through generations. He told her that the valley had never been abandoned, not entirely. Some descendants had hidden in the mountains after the cleansing, when the last outsiders tried to intervene. The sickness, as he called it, wasn't a curse to them. It was inheritance, identity, the price of purity. He claimed it connected them all, body and mind, to the land itself. "The mountain feeds us," he murmured, placing a hand over his chest. "And we feed it in return." Eliza's scientific instinct clashed with the unease twisting in her stomach. His skin bore faint, branching veins that pulsed faintly beneath the surface, almost luminous in the dim light. She realized with dawning horror that whatever genetic mutation plagued this family had reached a point beyond human understanding. The man looked at her as though he recognized her, not her face, but her blood. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered, his expression almost mournful. "Now it will remember you too." The storm began without warning. Thick clouds rolled over the valley, swallowing the peaks in darkness as rain poured in heavy sheets. Eliza had barely made it back to the cabin when thunder cracked so close it rattled the windows. The wind howled through the trees, tearing at the old boards, shaking the structure to its core. She was about to secure the door when a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the hills outside. For a split second, the earth looked alive, pulsing, shifting, as if something beneath the soil was moving. Then the ground trembled violently, and she heard the sound of splintering wood and collapsing stone echo from the slope beyond the stream. When the storm finally began to ease, the forest fell eerily quiet again. But the silence didn't feel like peace, it felt like a held breath. Driven by both fear and curiosity, Eliza ventured out at dawn. The rain had washed away much of the path, and fog still clung to the valley floor. As she followed the trail toward the collapsed hillside, she saw that part of the mountain had caved in, revealing a hollow space beneath the earth. It wasn't a natural cave. The exposed ground revealed wooden beams, rusted nails, and stone walls, an underground structure hidden for decades. Her hands shook as she climbed closer, brushing away mud and debris. The faint smell of decay seeped into the air. Inside, the dim light from her flashlight cut across rows of wooden boxes arranged in careful order, half buried and sealed shut. She knelt beside the nearest one, prying it open with trembling fingers. What she saw inside made her breath catch. The body was astonishingly well preserved despite its age, skin pale and leathery, features distorted but unmistakably human. Its eyes were closed, its mouth slightly open, as if caught mid-sentence. She moved to another, then another, and the truth unfolded like a nightmare. Each box held a body, men, women, even children, all sharing the same facial structure, the same bone deformities she had seen in the photographs. Some were dressed in clothing decades old, others wrapped in plain cloth. These weren't graves. They were preservations, as if the valley's people had been buried not to be forgotten but to be remembered. Then she noticed the carvings above the burial site, symbols etched into the stone in a language she didn't recognize. At the center of the chamber stood a single, larger coffin, sealed with iron bands and carved with the same initials she had seen on the photograph's frames. When she touched it, the wood felt strangely warm, as though something beneath still lived. The realization hit her with cold clarity. The bloodline had not ended, It had been entombed, preserved by those who believed death could not sever their connection to the land. The sickness was not gone, it was waiting, patient beneath the soil, as if the valley itself was keeping watch over its creation, guarding its secret until someone came to wake it again.